$25. Is that all you'll offer for a beast that can pull a plow by herself? The word slick with the auctioneer's scorn struck Angela harder than a fist. They were meant to. Here in the sun-bleached square of Wyatt's Crossing, cruelty was a spectator sport. She stood on the splintered planks of the auction platform barefoot and bound the midday sun a merciless hammer against her skull. The heat radiated from the wood, searing the soles of her feet, but it was the coldness of the eyes upon her that made her shiver. A mob of dusty faces stared up at her, farmers, ranchers, and townsfolk, drawn by the grim novelty of a human sale. They called it a hiring auction, a way for the desperate and indebted to find purpose. But Angela knew the truth. It was a marketplace for broken souls, and she was the day's prime offering. Who in their right mind would want that? A man cackled, his voice a rusty hinge. She'd crush a bed in one night. A horse's yoke would snap under her weight, another muttered, spitting a stream of tobacco juice that stained the dust near her feet. The crowd chuckled, a low rumbling sound, drunk on dust and casual malice. Angela's throat burned, not from thirst, but from the effort of swallowing every insult whole, letting them settle like stones in her stomach. She kept her chin tilted upward, a small act of defiance that felt monumental. Her family, what was left of it, had traded her for a sack of flour and a pound of lard. Too big to keep too strong for a husband. Better she work than waste. The words echoed in her mind, a final severing blow. Inside her clenched right hand, hidden from view, her fingers traced the familiar shape of a small, worn object, a wooden bird whittled from a piece of pine by her father's hands years ago. The wood was smooth, softened by 1,000 anxious touches. She squeezed it, and for a fleeting moment the jeers of the crowd faded, replaced by the crisp scent of pine and the sound of laughter in a snowy yard. She was 8 again, her small hands gripping the end of a split log, her father at the other. Heave, he'd grunted, a wide grin splitting his beard. Together they had lifted it, stacking it neatly beside the cabin wall. The snow fell in fat, silent flakes around them, and the world was quiet and good. Her strength had been a gift and then a source of shared pride. "You're stronger than most boys, Angie," he'd say, ruffling her hair. "And that's nothing to be ashamed of. That's the strength of the mountains in you." A fever had taken him the same year the farm gave out, leaving her with only the memory of his kindness and the little wooden bird. Now the strength he had celebrated was the very thing that had condemned her to this platform. $40, barked the auctioneer, Clyde Hargrove, his face florid with impatience. "Come on, gentlemen, look at those arms. She could haul water a mile without breaking a sweat." No hands rose. The sun beat down. Angela's wrists, raw and red from the loosely tied rope, began to tremble, not from fear, but from the sheer soul-crushing weight of humiliation. She's too big to keep indoors. A woman in a faded calico dress scoffed from the edge of the crowd. Probably eat more than 3 men combined? She'd scare the devil himself straight back to hell, another jeered, and the laughter erupted again, louder this time. Hargrove's professional smile twitched. "30 then, who will take her for 30? A silence fell over the square, the kind that scraped against the bone. Even the wind seemed to have died, leaving the air thick and stagnant with contempt. Folks began to murmur, shifting their weight, their interest already waning. Angela could feel her dignity peeling away like sunburnt skin. 25. Final offer. Hargrove's voice was flat defeated. He was about to declare her unsold a failure even as property when the sound of steady footsteps cut through the murmuring. Measured, calm, a rhythm that did not rush. A man stepped through the parting crowd. He was not the tallest man there, but his presence seemed to take up all the air. He wore a worn duster over broad shoulders, and his hat was pulled low, casting his face in shadow. His boots, scuffed and practical, kicked up little puffs of dust that settled back into silence. Dennis Cole. Most folks only whispered his name. He was a man of solitude, a rancher who lived tucked away in the canyons, a man who never drank, never bragged, but whose word on land or cattle was considered gold. He owned no more than he needed and wanted nothing from anyone. No one crossed him. He walked straight to the platform and stopped at its base, looking up. The murmurs died instantly. Even Hargrove froze his mouth slightly agape. Angela met the shadow of the man's gaze, bracing herself for another wave of judgment, another cruel assessment. Instead, Dennis Cole removed his hat, revealing a face etched with the quiet lines of sun and sorrow. He climbed the 3 wooden steps, his movements economical and sure. He didn't address Hargrove. He didn't glance at the crowd. His eyes, the color of a stormy sky, were fixed on her. Without a word, without asking permission, he slid one powerful arm under her knees and the other behind her back. Angela's breath caught in her throat. A jolt, electric and sharp, shot through her. She should have struggled, should have fought the indignity of being handled like a sack of grain. But the moment his arm steadied her, cradling her against his chest, something unfamiliar surged through her. It was not pity. It was not charity. It was respect. He lifted her as if she weighed nothing at all. Gasps rippled through the square. Angela, held aloft, stared at the stunned faces below. They were no longer leering. They were witnessing something they did not understand. Dennis looked out at them, his expression unreadable. Then his gaze returned to her. His voice was quiet, but it carried across the silent square like thunder rolling in from a distant mountain. "You're just right for my arms." He spoke the words, not to the crowd, but to her. For her. The square fell so silent that Angela could hear the frantic, hopeful pounding of her own heart. He carried her down the steps, moving through the gawking townsfolk as if they were nothing more than sagebrush. As he turned the corner of the general store away from the auction platform and the shame it held, the first tear escaped Angela's eye and traced a clean path through the grime on her cheek. It was not a tear of sorrow. It was a tear born from the profound, earth-shattering shock of being chosen. The wagon creaked a rhythmic complaint against the rutted trail that led out of Wyatt's Crossing. Angela sat stiffly on the rough wooden bench, the memory of the auction, a fresh brand on her soul. Beside her, Dennis Cole handled the reins with a quiet competence, his profile as stoic and unyielding as the red rock formations that rose from the valley floor. The silence between them was vast, broken only by the clop of the horse's hooves and the sigh of the wind through the tall grass. "You didn't have to buy me," she said finally, her voice raspy from disuse. The words felt small in the immense landscape. He didn't look at her. "Wasn't buying," he replied, his tone even. "Just stopping a circus." "Is that what I was, a sideshow?" The bitterness in her voice surprised even her. He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he reached behind the bench, pulled out a folded wool coat, and handed it to her. It was heavy and smelled faintly of pine leather and wood smoke. "For the rope burns," he said, nodding toward her raw wrists. She hesitated, then draped it over her shoulders. The warmth was immediate, a stark contrast to the chill of humiliation that still clung to her. "I don't need pity." "Good," he said, his eyes on the trail ahead. "I don't offer it." Silence fell again, but it felt different this time. Not cold, but unfinished. The trail curved upward, winding through hills dotted with gnarled juniper trees. In the distance, the mountains loomed, their peaks still crowned with the last of the winter snow. Angela clutched the edges of the heavy coat, the soft wool a strange comfort. Her wrists throbbed, but not as intensely as the dull ache behind her ribs and the ache of a spirit, long bruised. As the sun dipped lower, casting long, distorted shadows across the land, two riders approached from the opposite direction. They slowed as they passed, their gazes lingering on Angela. One of them, a man with a mean-looking scar bisecting his eyebrow, tipped his hat in a gesture of mocking politeness. "Still collecting strays, Cole," he drawled. Dennis didn't so much as flinch. His hands remained steady on the reins, his focus unwavering. The riders moved on, their laughter carried back on the wind. Angela felt a knot of tension tighten in her stomach. "They know you," she stated. "Everyone in town does." "Small town," he said, his voice clipped. "What do they say about you?" She pressed, driven by a need to understand the man who had plucked her from public shame for reasons she couldn't fathom. He was quiet for a long moment, watching the trail as if reading a story in the dust. "They say I don't take bribes, don't drink, and don't marry for money." She blinked, processing the last part. "That sounds personal." "Had offers," he said simply. "Didn't like the terms." She studied his profile. The hard line of his jaw, the deep-set eyes that seemed to see more than they let on. "So you live alone. No wife, no family. And people think you're strange for it." He finally turned to meet her eyes. His were a clear, startling gray, like river stones underwater. "You think I'm strange too?" The directness of the question caught her off guard. She considered it, then answered honestly. "I think people fear what they don't understand," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "I should know." A flicker of something recognition perhaps passed through his eyes. He turned his attention back to the trail, but she noticed the tight set of his jaw had eased slightly. By the time twilight began to paint the sky in shades of bruised purple and soft orange, the wagon rolled into a narrow canyon. Tucked into the valley like a secret held close to the earth was Dennis's ranch. It was not a sprawling enterprise, but a modest, well-kept homestead. The house was built of wood and stone, solid and unpretentious, with a curl of smoke rising from the chimney. A corral stretched to the east, where a handful of horses grazed peacefully. There were no ranch hands, no voices calling out, just the whisper of the wind through the pines and the creak of a distant gate hinge. It was a place of profound solitude. Angela climbed down from the wagon, her legs stiff. She followed him inside. The house was as simple and clean as its owner. A rifle was mounted above the stone hearth, a small shelf of books stood against one wall, and the air was filled with the lingering scent of coffee. On the mantelpiece, a single faded photograph in a wooden frame caught her eye. It was of a young woman with soft eyes and windswept hair, her smile gentle but full of life. Angela paused, her hand hovering just above the frame. "Your wife." Dennis, who had been at the stove with a kettle in hand, froze. The simple object seemed to become impossibly heavy. "Was going to be," he said, his voice low and rough around the edges. He set the kettle down with a soft, metallic clink. Her name was Eliza. He didn't turn to face her, but kept his back to her, as if the memory were a private burden. "We were coming back from visiting her mother. 5 men ambushed us on the North Trail. Wanted my horses." He paused, and the silence that followed was heavy with unspoken pain. She didn't make it." Angela's breath hitched. "I'm sorry." "She was small," he said, his voice hollow. "People said she wasn't made for this kind of life. But she had a fire in her. Wouldn't let a man speak a cruel word without answering him back tenfold." Angela stepped closer, drawn by the raw grief in his voice. "You still love her?" It wasn't a question. He gave a single sharp nod. "Some things don't leave you, even when the world moves on. She turned from the photograph, the firelight catching the dark bruises on her arms. The question that had been simmering within her finally boiled over. Then why bring me here? You barely know me. He finally turned, and his gray eyes met hers, clear and direct. Because when I looked up at you on that platform, I saw something familiar. Not in your size, in your eyes. He took a step closer. You're not a stray, he said, his voice softening. You're someone the world misunderstood. He paused, his gaze unwavering. So was she. Angela looked down at her hands, her throat tight with an emotion she couldn't name. For the first time since her father's death, she didn't feel like a mistake. She didn't feel like a burden. In the quiet solitude of the stranger's home, surrounded by the ghosts of his past, she felt for the first time seen. Angela had never known silence like the one that lived on Dennis's ranch. It wasn't the empty silence of loneliness, the kind that wrapped around your ears like cotton wool, but a living silence filled with the rustle of leaves, the nicker of horses, and the distant cry of a hawk circling overhead. It was a silence that echoed in your chest, leaving space for thoughts to grow. Yet for Angela, the quiet was a strange kind of prison. She didn't know what to do with the freedom of it. She moved through the small house with a careful, deliberate slowness, hyper-aware of her own size. She was terrified of knocking over the lantern on the table, of cracking the simple ceramic mug, of breaking something in this quiet, ordered world. The house wasn't cramped, but her life had taught her to feel as though she was always taking up too much space. Each morning she rose before the sun, a habit ingrained by years of hard labor. She chopped wood, her axe splitting the logs with clean, satisfying cracks. She fetched water from the well, the heavy buckets a familiar weight in her hands. She swept the porch until it was free of every speck of dust. Dennis never asked her to do these things. He never gave her orders. But stillness made her feel useless, like a tool left to rust in a corner, waiting to be told its purpose. Their evenings were spent at the small wooden table, the flickering lamplight casting long shadows on the walls. The first few nights their meals were eaten in a tense, almost complete silence. He'd ask how she liked the stew. She'd say it's fine. He'd offer her the last biscuit. She'd refuse. He would simply nod, his expression unreadable. But Dennis noticed things. He noticed the way she had to duck her head every time she passed through the front doorway. One afternoon, she returned from the well to find him planing the top of the doorframe. He didn't say a word about it, just whistled a tuneless, quiet song as the wood shavings fell to the ground. The next time she walked through, her head cleared it with an inch to spare. He noticed how she perched uneasily on the edge of the straight-backed kitchen chairs, as if afraid they might splinter beneath her. A few days later, a new chair appeared at the table. It was wider, sturdier, built from solid oak, with a simple, elegant design. She ran her hand over the smooth, sanded wood. That evening, for the first time, she didn't feel like she might break something just by sitting down. "Thank you," she said, her voice quiet in the lamplit room. He didn't look up from his plate. "About time the house fit both of us," he replied. Angela didn't know what to say. No one had ever made space for her before. People had always expected her to shrink, to make herself smaller to fit their world. This quiet, solitary man was rebuilding his world to make a place for her within it. He didn't look at her the way others did, with a mixture of pity, fear, or crude calculation. He looked at her with clear, steady eyes, as if he simply saw her, and didn't flinch. Still, trust was a slow-growing seed in barren ground. She kept her distance, and he never tried to cross the invisible line she had drawn between them. Sometimes, while she was mending a fence or splitting logs with a rhythmic efficiency, she would feel his eyes on her. It wasn't the curious gaze of a stranger, but the watchful, respectful look of a man who was learning. The silence between them lingered a coiled rope of unspoken questions, and shared sorrows never pulled taut, never allowed to go slack. She wanted to leave before she became a burden. She suspected he wanted her to stay. The first direct threat came not with a shout, but with a whisper of poison. One morning, Dennis went to water the horses and returned with his jaw set like stone. "The well's been fouled," he said, his voice dangerously low. "Someone dumped a sack of lye down it during the night." Angela's blood ran cold. The well was their only source of fresh water, its contamination an act of deliberate, malicious sabotage. Who would do that, she asked, though a name already echoed in the back of her mind. "Only one man I know is patient enough for this kind of cruelty," Dennis said, his eyes turning toward the distant hills that separated his land from the largest spread in the county Redstone holdings, Silas Merritt. Dennis explained that Merritt was a man who saw the world as a map of things he was entitled to own. For years he had been trying to buy up the smaller ranches in the valley, consolidating his power. Dennis's land, with its reliable spring and sheltered canyon, was the jewel he coveted most. "He tried to buy me out years ago. I refused," Dennis said, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. "He doesn't take no for an answer." Attached to the well pump by a piece of twine was a small, crudely carved wooden snake. It was Merritt's calling card, a silent promise of venom yet to come. The act forced them out of their quiet solitude. They had to haul water from the creek a mile away, a back-breaking task that consumed their days. But more than that, it forced them to act. The silent war had begun. "He's trying to starve us out," Angela said that evening, her arms aching from carrying the heavy buckets. "He's trying to break my spirit." Dennis corrected her, his gaze intense. "He thinks if he makes this life hard enough, I'll sell." "Will you?" "Never." The word was absolute, an oath sworn to the land and to the memory of the woman he had lost on it. In that moment, Angela understood. This wasn't just a dispute over territory. It was a battle for a man's soul. And now, whether she wanted it or not, she was part of it. The poison in the well was not just an attack on Dennis. It was a message to her as well. "You are not safe here. You do not belong." The poison in the well was only the beginning. Silas Merritt was a patient predator, and his next attack was aimed not at their resources, but at their reputation. He began to seed the town with rumors, whispers that spread like wildfire through the dry tinder of local gossip. A week after the well was fouled, Angela rode into Wyatt's Crossing alone to pick up flour and salt from the general store. Dennis had needed to ride out to the far pasture to check on a section of fence that had been mysteriously cut during the night. As she tethered her horse, she felt a subtle shift in the town's atmosphere. Conversations that had been lively moments before fell to a hushed murmur as she passed. Eyes followed her no longer with simple curiosity, but with a new sharp edge of suspicion. Inside the general store, the air was thick with the scent of coffee beans, cured meats, and something else, prejudice. Mrs. Gable, the storekeeper's wife, who had always been polite if distant, barely met Angela's gaze. "Just the flour and the salt today," Angela said, placing her list on the counter. Mrs. Gable weighed the items with a grim slowness, her lips pursed into a thin, disapproving line. As she handed over the parcels, a woman standing nearby, Mrs. Hemlock, the town's most notorious gossip, spoke loudly to her companion. "They say his well went bad right after she arrived. Cursed, I tell you. Some folks are just born carrying misfortune with them." Angela froze, her hand hovering over the sacks. She could feel every eye in the store on her. Her face burned with a familiar shame, hot and suffocating. She wanted to turn and flee, to run back to the quiet solitude of the canyon, where the only judgment came from the silent, watching hawks. But then she remembered the way Dennis had looked at her, the quiet respect in his eyes. She remembered the solid feel of the oak chair he had built for her. Straightening her shoulders, she met Mrs. Hemlock's venomous gaze directly. "Misfortune isn't carried, Mrs. Hemlock." Angela said, her voice low but clear, cutting through the silence. "It's delivered, usually by men with small minds and loud mouths." A collective gasp went through the small crowd. Mrs. Hemlock's face turned a blotchy red. Before she could retort, Angela paid for her goods, her movements deliberate and calm, and walked out of the store with her head held high. The incident at the store was a small victory, but it solidified her position in the town's narrative. She was no longer just the big girl from the auction. She was now a source of bad luck, an unnatural woman, a blight on the community. Merritt's poison was working. The confrontation he had been orchestrating finally came to a head on Sunday. Dennis insisted they attend the church service, arguing that hiding would only fuel the rumors. As they took a seat in a pew near the back, the small chapel filled with a palpable tension. The preacher's sermon on tolerance and neighborly love was laced with an irony so thick Angela could almost taste it. After the service, as the congregation milled about outside in the churchyard, Silas Merritt himself made his appearance. He was a stark contrast to Dennis, tall and elegantly dressed in a tailored suit, his handsome face arranged in an expression of genteel concern. He moved through the crowd with an easy charm, shaking hands, kissing babies, a benevolent lord among his subjects. He finally stopped in front of Dennis and Angela, his smile never quite reaching his cold, calculating eyes. "Cole," he said, his voice smooth as polished riverstone. "I was so sorry to hear about your troubles. A fouled well fence is cut. It's a dangerous world for a man living all alone." His gaze slid pointedly to Angela. "Or with temporary help." Before Dennis could respond, a farmer whose land bordered Merritt's spoke up, his voice loud enough for everyone to hear. "It's not just him, Mr. Merritt. My prize bull took sick last week, died yesterday. The day after, she was seen walking near my pasture." He jabbed a finger in Angela's direction. A wave of murmurs swept through the crowd. Merritt placed a comforting hand on the farmer's shoulder. Now, Elias. We mustn't jump to conclusions. But one does have to wonder. This valley was peaceful until recently." Angela felt the trap closing around her. She was being tried and convicted in the court of public opinion, with Merritt acting as both prosecutor and judge. Dennis stepped forward, placing himself slightly in front of Angela. His voice was quiet, but it commanded attention. "My well was poisoned with lie Elias. Lie that Merritt's tannery is the only one to import for 50 miles. And your bull didn't just take sick. I saw the tracks near your fence line. Someone fed it loco-weed." He turned his gaze directly on Merritt. This valley was peaceful until a snake decided he wanted to own it all. The accusation hung in the air, sharp and undeniable. Merritt's charming facade cracked for a fraction of a second, revealing the cold fury beneath. The crowd shifted uncomfortably, caught between the quiet conviction of Dennis Cole and the powerful influence of Silas Merritt. No one knew what to believe. The seed of doubt had been planted, and Angela knew with a sinking heart that its roots were already taking hold. They were isolated, surrounded by a community that was quickly being turned against them. The wall of suspicion the town had erected was colder and harder than any stone. In the days that followed the confrontation at the church, Angela felt like a ghost moving through a world that refused to see her as human. She was a harbinger of bad luck, a curse, an omen. The whispers followed her everywhere. She knew she should leave, that her presence was putting Dennis in an impossible position. But the thought of surrendering to Merritt's vicious campaign filled her with a stubborn, defiant anger. Determined to find a way to fight back, to understand the true depth of the venom aimed at them, Angela found herself drawn to the past. She needed to understand Eliza, the woman whose memory hung over the ranch like a morning mist. If Merritt's hatred was truly about the land, why did his attacks feel so deeply, cruelly personal? One rainy afternoon, while Dennis was out checking traps, Angela found herself in the small loft of the barn. Dust motes danced in the slivers of light, cutting through the weathered planks. In a dark corner beneath a canvas tarp sat a small leather-bound trunk. It was Eliza's. Dennis had never mentioned it, but Angela knew. It was the only object in the entire ranch that seemed untouched, preserved in a bubble of grief. Her hands trembled slightly as she lifted the heavy lid. The air inside smelled of dried lavender and old paper. Neatly folded on top was a simple blue dress. Beneath it lay a collection of keepsakes, a book of poetry with pressed flowers between its pages, a small pouch of polished river stones, and a bundle of letters tied with a faded ribbon. Angela sat down on the dusty floorboards and carefully untied the ribbon. The letters were from Eliza's family, full of news from back east of births and weddings and lives that seemed a world away from the harsh realities of the frontier. She read through them, her heart aching for the young woman who had chosen love over comfort, a wild land over a safe home. Tucked at the very bottom of the bundle was a small, stiff piece of cardstock, a photograph. Angela turned it over. It showed Eliza radiant and smiling, standing beside a tall, well-dressed young man. He had his arm around her, his expression proprietary, possessive. His face was handsome, familiar. Angela squinted, trying to place him. He looked like a younger, less hardened version of the man who had confronted them in the churchyard. Her heart began to beat faster. She turned the photograph over. On the back, in faint looping script, were two sets of initials, E, P, and S-M. Eliza Prescott and Silas Merritt. The pieces clicked into place with a sickening finality. This wasn't about land. Not entirely. This was about Eliza. That evening, the storm that had been brewing outside broke with a ferocious intensity. Rain lashed against the windows, and the wind howled through the canyon. Inside, the fire crackled in the hearth, a small pocket of warmth against the tempest. Angela waited until Dennis had finished his meal, her nerves stretched taut. She placed the photograph on the table between them, without a word. Dennis stared at it, his face paling. The easy calm he usually wore was stripped away, leaving his grief raw and exposed. "Where did you find this?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "In her trunk, in the barn." He closed his eyes for a moment, as if struck by a physical blow. When he opened them again, the story he had held back for so long finally came pouring out. "Silas Merritt is Eliza's brother." He said the words heavy as stones. "Her older brother?" "He was protective. He never approved of me. He thought I was a stubborn fool dragging his sister out to this savage land to die." Dennis traced the edge of the photograph with a calloused finger. Eliza was strong-willed. She loved this place. She saw the beauty in it, not just the hardship. She told him she was staying, that this was her home now. Silas saw it as a betrayal. He begged her to come back east, offered her money, anything to leave me. When she refused, he disowned her, told her she was dead to him. Angela listened, her chest tight with a dawning horror. After she died, Dennis continued, his voice thick with pain. "He showed up here. He didn't come to mourn. He came to blame. He stood right where you're sitting and told me I had killed her. That my stubborn pride and my love for this worthless piece of dirt had cost his sister her life. He looked up, his eyes filled with a haunted fire. He didn't just want the land anymore. He wanted to destroy everything I had built on it. He wanted to ruin me to prove that he was right all along. That this place was nothing but a graveyard. The wind rattled the window pane, a mournful cry that seemed to echo the grief in the room. The conflict was no longer a simple land dispute. It was a tragic, twisted vendetta fueled by a brother's misguided grief and an all-consuming need for revenge. Silas Merritt wasn't just trying to drive Dennis off the land. He was trying to burn down a memory, to erase the choice his sister had made, a choice that had put her beyond his control. And Angela, by her very presence, had become the new focal point of his rage. She wasn't just a stray Dennis had collected. In Merritt's eyes, she was a replacement, an insult to Eliza's memory, and another soul he needed to save from Dennis Cole's destructive influence. The revelation that Silas Merritt was Eliza's brother changed everything. His campaign of terror was no longer just business. It was a holy war, and Angela was the infidel. Realizing that Dennis now had an ally, a woman whose strength was not so easily broken, Merritt escalated his attacks, focusing his venom directly on her. He used his considerable influence in Wyatt's Crossing to turn the town into a fortress of hostility. When Angela went to the general store, Mrs. Gable informed her with false regret that she was no longer welcome to trade there. "We can't risk associating with ill fortune," she'd said, refusing to meet Angela's eye. The blacksmith, who had once admired her skill in mending a broken plow, now turned his back when she passed. Merritt's rumors grew more vicious, twisting her physical strength into something monstrous and unnatural. Whispers of witchcraft began to circulate, tales of her communing with animals and possessing the evil eye. Mothers would physically pull their children away as she walked down the street, making signs against evil. She was utterly alone, an outcast in a town that had already judged her. The isolation was a heavier burden than any physical labor she had ever endured. "This has to stop," she told Dennis one night, her voice strained. "Let me leave. If I'm gone, he'll have no one to target. His war is with you, but he's using me as his weapon." "No," Dennis set his jaw tight. "If you run, he wins. He proves that this land breaks everyone I care about. We stand our ground. Together." His resolve was a shield, but Angela could see the toll it was taking on him. He was stretched thin, watching the ranch, watching the town, watching over her. The final brutal escalation came on a moonless night, the kind of inky blackness that swallows all light and sound. Angela was awoken not by a noise, but by a sudden, violent trembling of the barn. The horses were screaming, a raw, terrifying sound of pure panic. She threw on her boots and ran outside, her heart hammering against her ribs. The main barn door was barred from the outside, and the acrid smell of smoke was beginning to snake through the cracks. They were trying to burn the animals alive. Rage, pure and white-hot, surged through her. She grabbed a heavy fence post lying nearby and used it as a battering ram, slamming it against the crossbar. Wood splintered. On the third blow, the bar cracked and the doors flew open. Inside was chaos. The stable was thick with smoke from a pile of oil-soaked rags that had been tossed into the hayloft. The horses, their eyes wide with terror, crashed against the walls of their stalls. A single spark could turn the entire structure into an inferno. "Easy now, easy," she yelled, her voice a strange mix of command and comfort. She moved into the choking smoke, unlatching the stalls, her presence a calming force in the midst of the panic. Just as she was leading the last horse out, 3 figures emerged from the shadows behind the barn. They were Merritt's men, the same ones who had taunted Dennis on the trail. They carried clubs. "Mr. Merritt wants you gone," the one with the scarred eyebrows snarled. "One way or another." Angela positioned herself between the men and the now fleeing horses. She held nothing but her own 2 hands. For a moment they hesitated, taken aback by her sheer defiant presence. Then they charged. What followed was not a fight. It was a force of nature unleashed. The years of being told she was too much, too strong, too big, culminated in a single explosive release. She moved with the deliberate, unstoppable power of a river. She didn't throw punches. She blocked, parried, and shoved using their own momentum against them. One man lunged, and she caught him, lifting him off his feet and tossing him into a water trough with a tremendous splash. Another swung his club, but she caught his arm twisted and sent him sprawling into the mud, his weapon flying from his grasp. The scarred man, the leader, watched in disbelief before a figure tackled him from the side. It was Dennis, a silent fury in his eyes, having been alerted by the commotion. The fight was over in seconds. Merritt's men scrambled to their feet and fled into the darkness, leaving behind only the smoldering rags and the lingering scent of their fear. Angela stood panting, her knuckles bruised, her clothes reeking of smoke. The immediate danger had passed, but as she looked toward the main road, she saw them, a small group of townsfolk, neighbors from the nearest homesteads, drawn by the sounds of the struggle. They stood in silence, holding lanterns aloft, their faces illuminated in the flickering light. They had seen it all, the fire, the attack, and her ferocious defense. They had seen not a monster, but a protector. For the first time, the whispers were silenced, replaced by a stunned, grudging respect. The seeds of doubt Merritt had so carefully planted about her had finally begun to wither in the face of the undeniable truth. The dry season had stretched on for months, turning the rolling hills and fertile fields of the valley into a landscape of tinder. The air was thick with heat, and even the wind felt brittle, carrying the scent of something waiting to burn. One evening, as a blood-red sun sank below the horizon, the fire came. It began as an orange glow on the southern ridge, a hungry blush against the twilight sky. Dennis saw it first, his body going rigid. He didn't need to guess the cause. This was not lightning. This was not an accident. This was Silas Merritt's final desperate act of war. He had stopped whispering and had finally bared his teeth. "They've set the south field ablaze," Dennis said, his voice a low growl as he burst into the house. Angela, who had been stitching a tear in a canvas sack, was on her feet in an instant. There was no time for fear. "We have to move." Now she said, her voice a steady command. "Get the buckets. Ring the church bell." Within minutes, the solemn, urgent clang of the bell echoed through the valley, a sound reserved only for death or disaster. Tonight it was both. They ran side by side, their long strides eating up the ground. Angela's lungs burned not from the effort, but from a cold, rising fury. The fire, fanned by an evening wind, moved with a terrifying speed, a wall of flame licking at the sky. By the time they reached the edge of the field, Dennis's entire barley crop, his livelihood for the year, was already a roaring inferno. But a far worse threat was emerging. The wind was shifting, turning the blaze away from the empty fields and directly toward the town, toward the orphanage that stood at its edge, toward the homes of the very people who had scorned her. "We need a fire break," Dennis shouted over the roar of the flames, his face grim in the hellish light. "It's moving too fast." Angela's eyes swept the property, her mind working with a desperate clarity. Between the fire and the town stood an old abandoned livestock wall, 100-foot-long relic from the valley's first settlers. It was built of massive, thick-cut logs, many of them half-rotted but incredibly heavy. "The old wall," she yelled, pointing. "If we can pull it down, it will form a barrier." Dennis stared at her, then at the wall. Angela, that would take 10 men and a team of oxen. She was already moving. "We don't have 10 men." She reached the first upright beam, a log as thick as her waist, and wrapped her arms around it. The wood was rough, splintered, digging into her skin. With a guttural roar that came from the deepest part of her soul, she pulled. Muscles bunched in her back and shoulders. The ground around the post groaned. Wood shrieked in protest. The post cracked at its base. The townspeople who had arrived with buckets and shovels stopped and watched in stunned silence. They saw her move to the next beam, and the next her body a testament to sheer, unyielding will. The massive structure groaned like a dying beast. Suddenly, a new sound cut through the roar of the fire, the high-pitched scream of a child. A small boy, the blacksmith's son, had gotten too close, mesmerized by the flames. A section of the weakened wall teetered its shadow, falling directly over him. Without a second's hesitation, Angela abandoned the main post and lunged, covering the boy with her own body, just as the heavy log crashed to the earth beside them, showering them with dirt and splinters. It was a choice made in a heartbeat, her life for his compassion, over the larger goal. She pushed herself up, ensured the terrified child was unharmed, and sent him scrambling back toward his father before returning to her task. With one final monumental heave, she brought the entire wall down. It collapsed with a thunderous crash, a chaotic barrier of splintered timber and earth directly in the path of the fire. It worked. The flames slammed into the makeshift firebreak, scattering and losing their momentum. The wall of fire was broken. Seizing the opportunity, the townspeople surged forward with their buckets and wet sacks, beating back the last of the embers. When it was over, Angela stood in the scorched earth, soaked in sweat, her arms and face coated in ash. She turned and saw them watching her, the entire town. The people who had called her a monster, a curse, a thing to be feared. Their faces, illuminated by the dying glow of the fire, held no scorn. There was only awe, respect, and a profound, humbling gratitude. Through the smoke, a figure on horseback appeared. Silas Merritt. He had been watching from a distance, a general observing a battle he was certain he had won. He rode forward, his face a mask of disbelief and rage. He stopped before Dennis, his voice dripping with venom. "You see, Cole, everything you touch turns to ash. You couldn't protect her, and you can't protect this place." He didn't have to, a voice called out. It was the blacksmith stepping forward, his son clinging to his leg. She did. Merritt's wild gaze fell on Angela, and something inside him seemed to snap. The veneer of the civilized man dissolved, revealing the broken, grieving boy beneath. "She was never meant to die," he screamed, his voice cracking, the confession tearing out of him. The whole town fell silent, listening. "I just wanted to scare her. The fire. It was just supposed to destroy the cabin, to make her see that this place was a death trap, to make her come home." His confession hung in the smoky air, a truth more devastating than any lie. The fire that killed Eliza, the one he had blamed Dennis for all these years, was an accident he had caused. His vendetta was born not of righteous anger, but of a monstrous projected guilt. Sheriff Miller, who had stood by while Merritt's influence poisoned the town, finally stepped forward, his face grim with the weight of his own complicity. He looked from the broken man on the horse to the woman who had just saved his town. The choice was clear. "Silas Merritt," the sheriff said, his voice ringing with newfound authority. "You're under arrest." Merritt didn't resist. He seemed to shrink in his saddle, a man finally crushed by the weight of a secret he had carried for too long. As his men were rounded up, Dennis moved through the crowd, his eyes locked on Angela. He reached her side and took her hand, his grip firm and sure. "She's not too big," Dennis said, his voice clear and steady for all to hear. "She's the reason we're all still standing." And in the silence that followed, broken only by the distant crackle of dying embers, the town of Wyatt's Crossing finally truly saw her. In the immediate aftermath of the fire, the truth settled over Wyatt's Crossing like a slow, cleansing rain. Silas Merritt's public confession had washed away the poison of his lies, leaving behind the stark, uncomfortable clarity of the town's own prejudice. With Merritt in the sheriff's custody awaiting the circuit judge, a profound sense of shame and gratitude began to work its way through the community. The acceptance Angela had never sought and never expected came not in words, but in quiet, meaningful actions. The morning after the fire, as she and Dennis surveyed the blackened field, the town blacksmith arrived in his wagon. He didn't say much, just unloaded a set of newly forged hinges for the barn door and a sharpened axe head, refusing any payment. "A town looks after its own," was all he said, but his eyes conveyed a deep, unspoken apology. Days later, a group of women from the church, led by a contrite Mrs. Gable, appeared at the ranch with armloads of food, freshly baked bread, savory pies, and jars of preserves. They didn't linger, didn't force conversation, but their offering was a clear and humble peace treaty. Angela's acceptance was no longer a question. It was a fact demonstrated in the simple, tangible currency of neighborly kindness. The ranch began to heal, and so did the rift between it and the town. The air in the canyon no longer felt heavy with solitude, but peaceful with a sense of earned belonging. The silent, comfortable rhythm between Angela and Dennis returned deeper now, forged in the crucible of shared adversity. They worked side by side, replanting, rebuilding their movements, an easy, unspoken partnership. Weeks later, when the first green shoots began to push through the charred earth of the south field, Dennis rode back from town with a thoughtful expression on his face. He found Angela by the creek, patiently teaching the blacksmith's son how to skip stones across the water's surface. He waited until the boy had run off his pockets full of smooth, flat rocks. He dismounted and stood beside her, the two of them watching the gentle flow of the water. "I had a thought," he said, breaking the comfortable silence. She turned to him, a small smile on her lips. "That can be a dangerous thing." He reached into his saddlebag and pulled out not a trinket or a gift, but a folded legal document tied with a simple string. He handed it to her. Her brow furrowed as she untied the string and unfolded the paper. It was a deed. Her eyes scanned the official script, the surveyor's marks, and landed on the newly registered name at the top. It read, Cole and Miller Ranch. Her breath caught in her throat. She looked up at him, her eyes wide with a question he had already answered. "This land, it was almost lost," he said, his voice quiet, but full of an unshakable conviction. "You saved it. Not just with your strength, but with your spirit. It's as much yours as it is mine. Its future is built on you, Angela." She stared at the paper, her name written beside his, a permanent mark on the land she had come to love. All her life, she had been treated as something to be sold, managed, or endured. She had been a burden, an oddity, a force to be contained. Now this man, this quiet, steady man, was not just offering her a home. He was offering her a foundation. He was making her an equal. Tears welled in her eyes, but for the first time in her life, they were tears of pure, unburdened joy. She didn't need to speak. He understood. He extended his hand, and she placed hers in it. Together, they stood by the creek, partners, in every sense of the word, and looked out over the valley. The land stretched before them, scarred, but healing, bathed in the warm light of the afternoon sun, a symbol of their shared past and the boundless promise of their future.